Compared to the alternative options for a lot cheaper, I don't think there's any way the Philadelphia Eagles are bringing back Josh Sweat in 2025. I'll tell you why coming up on this Thursday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Welcome into this Thursday edition of the show. Whether you're down in South Philadelphia or Australia, across the globe, we thank you so much for making us your first listen every single day. Not just Australia. Not sure why I shouted out that country today. Maybe I'll do a different country to shout out our international listeners and viewers every day. Anyway, though, let's get into today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. And we're going to start off our offseason options series talking about the edge position. And the edge position for the Eagles, it has two pillar foundation pieces long-term that I'm really excited about. Nolan Smith, Jalix Hunt. Nolan Smith had his breakout year 2 last year, a record-breaking amount of sacks in the playoffs for the Eagles with 4.5. No Eagle has ever had more in a single playoff run. Had 11 sacks total on the year when you combine the regular season and the postseason. I think he can take another step even farther in year 3, and I think he could be an elite double-digit sack guy in 2025. Jalix Hunt had an incredible playoff run. I think he could have a Nolan Smith-like breakout in year 2 with more snaps. Like, that is a traits guy that has a very high ceiling, and outside of Nolan Smith, even though Josh Sweat had the Super Bowl that he did, I thought Jalix Hunt was their second most consistent edge rusher in the 4 playoff games that they had. So they have two pillars, but they have work to do this offseason because they like to have at least 3 to 4 guys in this rotation. And I don't think there's any way that Josh Sweat does come back, and I don't think there's any way that he should come back. I just think when you look at the contract that he's going to get on the open market, especially after that Super Bowl performance, and you look at the alternative options that the Eagles have, there are a lot of options that are maybe just as good as Josh Sweat that you can get cheaper. I think Josh Sweat's not coming back to Philadelphia. In a vacuum, would I like Josh Sweat on the Eagles long term? Yeah, absolutely. This has nothing to do with the player. Again, he had one of the most dominant Super Bowl performances from a guy that's not a quarterback that I've ever seen. 2.5 sacks in that game on Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs. Outside of Jalen Hurts, he was the other guy that deserved the Super Bowl MVP trophy the most. And so I do think that this is a really good player. In his prime at 27 years old, he led the Eagles in sacks last year with 8. He's an ascending player still. Like, he gets better year after year, and it was really cool to see him overcome just completely disappearing down the stretch in 2023 to become that alpha this year when they lost Haason Reddick and Brandon Graham goes down. Yeah, Nolan Smith broke out, but Josh Sweat was that veteran that stepped up. And he's had a great 7-year run in Philly. It makes me feel old that Josh Sweat has already been with the Eagles for almost a decade. And he had a great career in Philly. For a 4th-round pick, he was the steal Todd McShay said he would be. He stayed healthy. That knee stayed intact. And I thought, Haason Reddick had some years in Philly. Brandon Graham had some elite seasons. You had a couple years of Vinnie Curry, Derek Barnett, Michael Bennett. But throughout his tenure in Philly from 2018 to 2024, Josh Sweat, I think, was always, outside of his rookie season, one of your 2 most consistent edge rushers. So it was a really good run, and yes, in a vacuum, I would like him back. But I do think that Super Bowl is going to allow him to cash in. Plus, again, he's 27 years old, and he just hired Drew Rosenhaus right before the Super Bowl, brought in one of the biggest names in sports agency that you can think of. We all remember Drew Rosenhaus from being, Terrell Owens' representation and Deshaun Jackson. Like, Josh Sweat said this is one of the biggest moments of his life, and that's why he brought in Rosenhaus. He is not going to take a team-friendly discount. Like, he bet on himself this past year, took a 1-year restructured deal with Philadelphia. By the way, the Eagles looked into trade options last offseason for Sweat. He banked on himself coming back, and it paid off. So he's going to get his bag, and he deserves it. But I just think when you look at what he'll get on a competitive open market as a 27-year-old prime edge rusher at such an important position, coming off the year he did and the championship performance he did, it's not going to be worth paying him, $25 plus million a year. He probably is not going to get 25 plus a year, but he's going to get over 20 a year, just like Milton Williams will. And when you look at so many other options that are like even par with Sweat when it comes to their talent, when it comes to their overall proven production and their age, what they're going to command on the open market. You also look at a very deep edge rusher class. You look at the fact that you do have two pillars already in place that are cheap in Nolan Smith and Jalix Hunt. You look at that and I say I don't think there's almost any chance that Josh Sweat is back next year. I think there's still a chance that Milton Williams comes back. If I was a betting man, I'd say no, he's not back. He's a player smack dab in the middle of his prime. That's a top 5 pass rusher at this position on the interior of the defensive line. Like, he's going to get a bag too, but I do think the Eagles could recognize him as a long-term pillar next to Jalen Carter. But I think with Josh Sweat, again, would you rather pay Josh Sweat the money he's going to get or pay a guy like we're going to talk about later that I mentioned in our offseason simulation, a Malcolm Kuntz? Would you rather pay him a short-term prove-it deal this year when Kuntz could be a similar level of player as Josh Sweat? Or you bring in, a player that's like in that tier 2, tier 3 to be a part of that rotation as your second or third guy or even the fourth guy, and then you draft somebody in the first or second round. I just think that idea makes a lot more sense, and it kind of lines up with what the Eagles' strategy was last year when they let Haason Reddick go. They said, yeah, Haason's in the middle of his prime, but instead of paying a player that top-tier money, why don't we do strength in numbers, which is what the Eagles normally do on the defensive line. Like, instead of paying Haason Reddick $20+ million a year, let's pay Bryce Huff $16 million. Let's bring back Josh Sweat. We have Nolan Smith. We have Brandon Graham. We're going to draft Jalix Hunt. Boom, we've got 5 guys that hopefully can make up that production. That's kind of what the Eagles have done in the past, and I don't think, like, if they didn't pay Haason Reddick last year, after the 2022 and 2023 that he had, I don't think there is any way that they pay Josh Sweat. So I'm okay with that. He's the one free agent, like, I would like there to be a way Mekhi Becton comes back on a team-friendly deal. I would love for them to find a way to bring back Milton Williams. They need to bring back Zach Bond. Like, they have to bring back Zach Bond. Josh Sweat is that one free agent of the top 4 that I haven't even considered coming back this year because I don't think it's going to be worth it, and I don't think the Eagles are going to consider giving him the money that he's going to get on the open market. Like, Josh Sweat is a very, very good edge rusher, and like I said, he's in his prime, coming off a great year where he proved everybody wrong and was that go-to guy in the biggest game of the season, but he's not a true alpha number 1 edge rusher. Like, there still were times at the end of 2024 where Josh Sweat kind of disappeared. Like, he's a streaky pass rusher. And I don't think he's going to be worth the contract that he gets. He's a really good pass rusher, but is he a 1A? Is he a 1? Is he the number 1, the go-to guy for your defensive line? I don't know if he's that guy. And so I wouldn't give him that kind of money, and I think that's the kind of money that he's looking for. He's a really good pass rusher, but I wouldn't say he's a great pass rusher. And there's a lot of pretty good pass rushers that have a similar resume as Josh Sweat that you could get for cheaper on the open market. And that's what we're going to get into coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. We start our offseason options series where we go through all of the possible trade candidates, free agent options, both at the top of the list and at the bottom for the Eagles at every single position. So we'll get into that coming up next right here on this Thursday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. All right, let's dive into it. Offseason options begins with, I think, the one position that the Eagles will be focused on the most this offseason, whether it's through free agency or the draft. I think it's going to be both the edge rusher position because they're likely going to lose 2 of their top 4 guys from the 2024 rotation. They're going to lose Brandon Graham, I think, to retirement. They're going to lose Josh Sweat, who's going to get a big payday on the open market. I don't think that they're really going to be competitive for Josh Sweat. I don't think they'll be willing to give him the contract that he can get on the open market because, again, there's just too many cheaper options that will replace Sweat's production by a pretty close percentage. Like, they might not be Josh Sweat next year, but it'll be pretty close. And, again, it'll be for cheaper, whether it's a rookie contract or it's another free agent signing. So I think there are other options, and they're going to let those 2 guys go. Brandon Graham to retirement, Sweat to free agency. You've got Nolan Smith and Jalix Hunt still in-house, but you do need to add two more guys to this rotation. So I think they'll end up drafting someone in the first 3 rounds, and they'll end up bringing in a free agent, or they'll trade for somebody. And of course, the number one offseason option for the Eagles to replace Josh Sweat is Myles Garrett. Like, that's the giant elephant in the room. Is Howie Roseman going to go all in and try to trade and then sign Myles Garrett? Interestingly enough, even though we know how much Howie Roseman prioritizes the trenches, investing top resources with top draft picks, big-time money, long-term contracts in offensive and defensive linemen. Like he said it the other day at the Combine, it's a, quote, unhealthy obsession that he has with linemen. You can never have enough. Even with that being said, Myles Garrett actually, like trading for Myles Garrett, that would be a first for Howie Roseman. Like he is no stranger to making the big trade for the big star. He did it with A.J. Brown in 2022. He signed a guy like that in Saquon Barkley last year. But when you look at his approach with the defensive line position, normally it's been strength in numbers, trying to find value, like going for more tier 2, tier 3 contracts, getting ahead of these players, ascending rise a year early, like paying Haason Reddick in the 2022 offseason. When you look at, some other value veteran moves, like trading for Michael Bennett, right? Or they like to grow these guys in-house as well. So they have a lot of team control. Brandon Graham, Vinnie Curry, Derek Barnett, Josh Sweat, Nolan Smith, Jalix Hunt. Like the list goes on and on. They've never really had that number one guy on the edge that makes like top 5 money that they traded for or signed. Like they haven't made that splash move really ever on the defensive line. It's always been through draft picks or smaller trades, smaller contracts. So if Howie Roseman's looking to do something that he's never done before, signing a running back last year, maybe one of those moves this year is paying a linebacker. It better be by paying Zach Bond. Maybe another one is trading for a Myles Garrett type, a multi-defensive player of the year player, and a guy that's a little bit older. He's still in his prime, but he's a little bit older. Like that would be a first, and it would be really interesting to see if he does that. I'm a fan of it. As I said yesterday, in a vacuum, I'm a big fan of bringing in Myles Garrett, but not at any cost. Like for me, I'd be willing to give up the 32nd overall pick. I'd be willing to give up another 2, maybe a 3 to get the deal done. But if it costs multiple ones, I'm really not in on that. I would rather bring in a lower level free agent, and I'd rather, if I'm going to invest a lot of those resources into getting a high impact edge rusher, I'd rather do it by using these resources to trade up in the draft. Go get me a James Pierce or a Jalen Walker, a Mikael Williams. Go get me one of those guys. I think that would be, go get me a Shamar Stewart from Texas A&M who measured into the combine at a ridiculous 6'5", 267 pounds, an insane wingspan. Like, go give me one of those guys that I have 5 years of team-controlled money. You know what I mean? So I'm in on the Myles Garrett idea, but not at all costs. Like, I don't have my blinders on for Myles Garrett. There's another offseason option, too, for the trade market, and I just saw he's on the block now. Tennessee Titans longtime pass rusher Harold Landry, which would cost less than Myles Garrett if you're looking for another trade option. Harold Landry, his sack numbers over the years, it's the proof is in the pudding. But I will say I'm not really in on this idea. Harold Landry has been at the bottom of the league the last few years when it comes to like pass rush win rate. This is kind of a cleanup sack king over the last few years. I really don't like that idea. If I'm going to trade assets for somebody that's a veteran, I'll just go all in and get Myles Garrett. But Harold Landry is another idea, if you like that would be available. And there's a couple other veterans, too, that I would be interested in. And one is Khalil Mack. And again, I get kind of 2018 to 2020 vibes with this move. Like, oh, yep, here we go. The Eagles are going to sign another older veteran that might want a ring chase. That's on a cheaper deal, but is he still the same player? Are we going to deal with injuries? Like, the Malik Jackson move kind of sticks out from 2019. But hey, the Eagles did do this when they traded for Michael Bennett in 2018. And although he only played 1 year in Philadelphia, I actually thought Michael Bennett was a really good player for that team coming off a Super Bowl win. So maybe Khalil Mack can be your new Michael Bennett, where for a year, he's that second guy in the rotation next to Nolan Smith, and him and Jalix Hunt have a similar snap count, and that's one of your guys in the 4-man rotation. I'd be okay with that. Like Khalil Mack, yeah, he's over 30, but if he wants to play football still, he's got a lot of juice left in him. Again, edge rushers, they age better than players at other positions. I mean, just look at his sack numbers. Last year, he had 6 sacks, which is good. 2 years ago, he had 17 sacks. 8 sacks in 2022, 6 in 2021. Like, this is a player that still has it. So I know he's older and, this might not be the move you love, but if Khalil Mack wants to ring chase and is willing to take a cheaper deal to go to a winner, like he's gotten his money, he's gotten his sack numbers. If he wants to go win a ring now, he is also an option on the open market. A couple other proven big names that I want to get into. Here's one that nobody liked when I mentioned this on X. If Howie Roseman, who has been into the idea of reunions with players over the years, Deshaun Jackson, Nick Foles, bringing back Jay Ajayi actually at one point. He brought back Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. Vinny Curry he brought back. This is what Howie does. He's a reunion guy. I know you guys probably will stick your nose up at this because he held out this year. There were reports that, players and coaches in the front office weren't happy that he was quote-unquote chasing sacks and he was more about getting paid and the individual goals than the team in 2023. But I think a reunion with Haason Reddick might actually make some sense. And I'm actually a defender of Haason Reddick. I got a lot of people on X saying yesterday, he's selfish. Look how bad he looks this year after holding out. We don't want a guy like that. He was a reason for the collapse in 2023. I'll argue that he had every right to hold out this year. Haason Reddick, in 4 years before this past season, had more sacks in that 4-year span than anybody that wasn't named TJ Watt and Myles Garrett. He was top 4 in sacks, top 5 in sacks over the last 4 years. And he should have got a payday after the 2022 season, and he was playing on a very undervalued, underpaid contract in 2023. And that was with Philadelphia. He wanted a new deal in Philly. The Eagles were not willing to give him that contract, so they traded him to the Jets, a brand new team that Haason Reddick didn't sign off on going to, and the Jets refused to pay him too. Why? If he wasn't going to play on that underpaid contract for the Eagles, the team he wanted to be with in the first place, then why the hell would he play on that contract for a brand new team? If the Jets thought he was going to do that, that was crazy. I thought he had every right last year to hold out. He had earned that payday. And when it comes to his role in the collapse of 2023, I'm not sure if I buy it. Haason Reddick, his job is to chase sacks. That's his goal. Maybe mentality-wise, that shouldn't be the sole focus, and it probably was for Haason. But again, if they had taken care of him earlier, if they had been progressive with him, not reactive with his contract, then I think you wouldn't have had to worry about that. And so I don't really, again, I think he was vindicated in his feelings. That's just personally how I feel about Haason Reddick. I think kind of like Chauncey Gardner-Johnson bringing him back last year, it would make a lot of sense. Haason, like Chauncey, he was upset about his contract in Philly. He wanted to be paid top dollar. He went out there and realized that market wasn't there. His market was not what he thought it was, so he had to sign a different kind of deal with Detroit, learned about what was out there, and came back to the team that he wanted to be with in the first place in the Eagles, and signed on a cheaper deal. Maybe the Eagles can work out the same thing with Haason Reddick. Hey man, you went out there to see what your market was. You couldn't get that contract. Maybe he's definitely not going to get it now in free agency. Come back to the Eagles, the team you wanted to be with to begin with, if you can remove your pride from this, like Chauncey Gardner-Johnson did, and come back and be a part of the Super Bowl team. Get the ring in 2025 that you didn't get in 2022. I think it's an idea I'd be interested in. Would the Eagles actually be interested in it? I don't think so. I don't think Vic Fangio and Haason Reddick would work. But I do think Howie Roseman might be interested. I would personally. But I think Vic Fangio is someone that could be in the way of some of these kinds of decisions, like bringing back Bryce Huff for another year. I think they're really going to listen to Vic this year, and he's earned that right to have that much say in defensive personnel. But me personally, I like the idea of bringing Haason Reddick back on a cheaper deal. And you have Haason Reddick, Nolan Smith, Jalix Hunt. That's a lot of explosiveness on the edge. It's a smaller group on the edge for sure. You'd want to bring in some size for the run game, but I don't hate the idea of a reunion with Haason. I know you all do, and Vic Fangio probably would, but I personally don't hate it. And then one other big name idea for the edge, Chase Young. Chase Young bet on himself, signed a 1-year deal with the New Orleans Saints. And is he the former top 2 pick that he was with the Washington Commanders back in the day? No. But he's a good football player. Like, he had a really good year last year. 5.5 sacks. His pass rush win rate was really strong. I think Chase Young, yeah, again, is he an alpha? Is he the guy Washington thought he was coming out of Ohio State? No. But he's always been productive in Washington and San Francisco and New Orleans. Like, he's kind of like a Josh Sweat, where I think he didn't hit the full ceiling of his physical abilities, but he hits, like, he definitely didn't crash out. He definitely is not a disappointment in the NFL. Like, he's a good rotational piece, and I think he's a similar player to Josh Sweat that you could probably get for cheaper. Josh Sweat's going to get paid more than Chase Young. Like, that's another guy. If you want a Josh Sweat level of player for cheaper, I kind of like the idea of Chase Young. But if you see, like, what I'm talking about here with Myles Garrett, Harold Landry, Khalil Mack, Haason Reddick, Chase Young, there are so many options out there to add to that 4-man rotation that I think you probably see why I wouldn't go all in on giving Josh Sweat a bag and signing him to just giving him a blank check. I just don't think that's a responsible way to use your resources in free agency this year. And there's other, like, if they want to go for cheaper guys, ascending players that are probably even cheaper than these names I'm mentioning, there's some other guys out there for that as well. And we'll get into it coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. All right, so we continue on our offseason options series with the edge position as we start things off at that position, because I think it's the most important one for the Eagles to add to this offseason. It's the edge rusher spot and it's defensive tackle. Like, I think the defensive line is the priority this offseason. This is a meat and potatoes kind of offseason. Let's do the dirty work. We've got our corners, our weapons, the skill position groups. Time to get some more big bodies into Philadelphia, because you're going to be losing some. Milton Williams, Josh Sweat, Brandon Graham, potentially Mekhi Becton. You got to add to the trenches on both sides of the ball. If the Eagles want to do what they normally do at the defensive line position, where they go for ascending young players that are cheaper, you try to get ahead of that breakout maybe a year or two early, get a guy on a prove-it deal because you have so much money invested in other spots. I do like some of the options that are out there. I mentioned in my offseason simulation the other day, Malcolm Kuntz from the Raiders, 26 years old, had 8 sacks in 2023. I've loved his game since he played for the University at Buffalo, who I used to produce for their radio station. Malcolm Kuntz has been a really good player. Max Crosby's a big fan of his. And the Eagles could get him on a prove-it deal, a 1-year deal, because he's going to want to, I think, raise his value coming off a season-ending injury last September. He lost the 2024 season. I think his value isn't where he wants it to be right now. I think he could be like this year's Josh Sweat, banks on himself, signs a 1-year deal in Philly, maybe breaks out, and then signs a big deal elsewhere or with the Eagles in 2026. Malcolm Kuntz, I think, makes a lot of sense for the Eagles. And another guy that makes sense in that way is, and I'm going to try to not butcher this name, from the Colts, Dayo Odeyingbo. Yeah, Dayo Odeyingbo. I think he's a perfect 3-4-man edge rusher in the rotation. Like, I don't think he's a top 2 guy, but he's a really solid player. And I think he adds some more size than some of these other guys, which is good against the run. He had 8 sacks in 2023, like Malcolm Kuntz. He had 3 sacks last year, 5 in 2022. Like, he can be your, I don't know, Vinny Curry, Derek Barnett type. Like, he's a good 3rd or 4th guy in the rotation. This isn't a Josh Sweat replacement. I think this is more of a Brandon Graham replacement in your rotation. Dayo Odeyingbo. I hope they sign someone else so I don't have to keep saying that name. And 2 more guys for you to look at. How about New York Giants edge rusher Azeez Ojulari, a former first-round pick? Again, this is an undersized edge group this year. If you're looking more for off-ball, like stand-up speed edge rushers, this is the crop for that. And I think that fits into Vic Fangio's defense for sure. Azeez Ojulari is a player that has proven sack production over the years. So since 2021, here's his sack production. 8 sacks his rookie year, 5.5 the year after, then dealt with some injuries, had 2.5 sacks in 2022, and then he had 6 sacks this past year. His pass rush win rate isn't as good as some of these other guys. He is kind of a cleanup sack guy, a lot like Harold Landry, but he does have sack production, and finishing is an important part of this position. So I think Azeez Ojulari is a guy that makes sense for the Eagles. Again, I don't think this is a number 1 or 2 guy in your rotation. This is more of a Brandon Graham replacement, a 3 or a 4 next to a rookie that you draft. But if you want a guy that's, a specialist on third down, I like Azeez Ojulari. That's who he was this past year with the Giants because they had Kayvon Thibodeau and Brian Burns. I think he's a good 3rd or 4th guy. He'll be cheaper than Josh Sweat and some of these other players. And here's why Howie Roseman's going to bring him in actuality. It's because he played at Georgia. That's why he's bringing in Azeez Ojulari. And then here's one other guy as we wrap up offseason options that I just can't quit, and it's Darrell Taylor. I have suggested Darrell Taylor for the Eagles every year since he was drafted in the 2nd round to the Seattle Seahawks out of the University of Tennessee. And it could make sense because the Eagles defensive line coach, Clint Hurt, he did coach Darrell Taylor for a few years with the Seattle Seahawks. Darrell Taylor is a guy that, again, I think he's disappointed. I don't think he's reached the ceiling that I thought he had, but he's had some big sack years. If you're looking for a rotational piece that's going to be a lot cheaper, I don't think Darrell Taylor is going to, he'll be the cheapest option of these players. I think he'd make some sense. Last year, he had 2 sacks, including a forced fumble in the first 2 games with the Bears. He was traded from the Seahawks to the Bears last year, finished the year with just 3 sacks. But when you look at the years before, 2023, 5.5 sacks with Seattle, 9.5 in 2022, 6.5 in 2021. He's only in year 5. I think maybe that's another buy low, low risk, high reward type of signing. Bring in a familiar face for Clint Hurt. Add him to the rotation. Darrell Taylor has always been a my guy for me. And I kind of like him as another last resort option. And by the way, here's another guy I didn't mention as a really big name because I don't think he's an option for the offseason, but maybe he's an option at the trade deadline. We mentioned Myles Garrett being the big fish. He's the big ticket item of this group. But there could be another guy that's thrown into the mix eventually. What about Max Crosby? I think there is a scenario this year where, let's say Jalen Hunt's good, not great, and Nolan Smith is kind of the same player as last year, which is a really good edge rusher. But let's say the Eagles need more depth. Their rookie they draft isn't totally ready to take on that snap count. Maybe they trade for Max Crosby at some point this year. The Raiders are not good, and I don't think they're going to be. I think Max Crosby is an option too. If Howie Roseman's going to finally invest a big-time move in the edge rusher position, Myles Garrett, of course, the obvious name, don't forget about Max Crosby. Max Crosby is mulling his future in Vegas. He is really trying to see what the future is there, especially at the quarterback position. If they go in again with I don't even know if they'll get Sam Darnold. If they bring in a Russell Wilson type with Pete Carroll, I think Max Crosby might want out of Las Vegas sooner rather than later. So as you can see, there are so many options, and this is just in free agency and trades alone. And you have the draft as well stacked on top of it. This is why I think there's a 0% chance Josh Sweat comes back, unless this oversaturated market does drop his value. Maybe he goes out there and doesn't see the deal he thinks he can get, and it does suddenly put the Eagles back in the ballpark of his range. I'm not sure. We'll kind of see how it works, but I would predict that he is not back in 2025. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Thanks so much for making us your first listen each and every day with the Combine this week. Make sure your second listen is the Locked On NFL Draft podcast with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Great stuff Monday through Friday, getting you ready for the 2025 NFL Draft. Thanks as always for downloading, watching, and listening, and let's go Birds. Fly, Eagles, fly.